Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and today we're continuing our Total War Pharaoh unit guide series with a guide covering Amenmesse faction unique units. Now previously our guides have focused on the native unit rosters, but that is only half of the game, as in Total War Pharaoh your recruitment is a combination of your faction unique units, which are location independent, and the native unit rosters, which will depend on your exact recruitment location. So for our Amenmesse unit guide here, we're going to go beyond just the 11 faction unique units, as the units from the Nubia and Kush native unit roster, the Upper Egypt native unit roster, and the Western Desert unit roster are all going to be equally important when playing as Amenmesse because you start near these three realms in the game. Therefore, your early to mid-game armies will consist entirely of these units, and to be honest, even by the late game, it is often too late or pointless to build up newly conquered provinces in faraway realms to make any meaningful adaptations or changes to your core army compositions. So, with that said, how this guide will work is that we're going to first go over the faction unique units, one recruitment building chain at a time, as each of these building chain represent a type of unit. And then we'll take a look at the unit's individual stats and then compare them to similar units from these relevant native unit rosters before consolidating everything into a tier by tier recruitment guide for the faction. And getting started with the melee infantry recruitment building chain, we can see that for Amenmesse faction, there are going to be 3 tiers for this building, spanning from tier 2 to 4. And within these 3 tiers are going to be 4 recruitable units. Starting with the tier 2 Kushite Runners, we have a 120 unit count, 2-handed spear infantry with a total health of 16,800 or 140 health per model. These are all very standard. It's lightly armored with just 15 points of average quality armor, but it has a decent morale at 50 and excellent speed of 45, as this will be a fast flanking infantry. For melee attacks and defense, it has above average stat line of 28 and 27, which also makes this unit quite balanced. For melee damage, it has a 2-handed spear, which will deal 29 base damage and 10 armor piercing damage, with 25 bonus points against large or chariots. As this unit is designed to be a flank attacker, its charge bonus is also quite high at 28. In addition to its melee stats, it also carries a 4 ammo 50 range projectile that will deal 13 base and 1 armor piercing damage with a very high accuracy of 13 and a reload time of just 5 seconds. For traits, it has shoot while moving for the projectile and hide in shrub and forest. For stances, it has the spear brace, which will give it charge reflect when braced. This gives this unit the additional role as a flank defender when facing multiple flanking chariots, but most of the time, you would not adopt this stance as this unit is simply better on the offense and does not do very well against range attack when braced since they are shieldless and low armored. Now, the best comparison we have for this unit from the relevant native unit rosters will be the Libu Desert Runners from the Western Desert roster. It has 3 more points of melee attack and 2 more points of charge bonus, but lacks the range projectile. Naturally, it will also not have the shoot while moving trait, but it more than makes up for this with its traits Desert Fighters and Sand Scorpions, which gives it supreme mastery when it comes to desert combat. In my opinion, the Libu Desert Runner is a better version of the Kushite Runner, as the range projectile does very minimum damage, but neither unit should be recruited as they're simply too weak defensively for the amount of damage they are going to bring with their 2-handed spears. For their role as an offensive flank charger that is relatively cheap in tier 2, the best alternative is actually going to be the Libu Raiders, which uses a hard-hitting 2-handed club. And in our Western Desert Native Unit Guide, I've already recommended this unit, and I'll do the same thing here, as the niche role of being a chariot counter doesn't really outweigh the weapon damage difference between these units, and when given the choice, I'm always going to opt for the Libu Raiders in Tier 2. Moving on to Tier 3, we have the Nubian Spearmen, which is the designated frontline unit for Amenmesse. In terms of melee stats, it's fairly typical for spear and shield infantry with 120 unit count, 18,000 health, or 150 health per unit, 60 armor of the good quality rating. 30 point of the armor is going to be coming from its shield, which will block 45% of incoming range attacks. Its morale is decent at 55. Speed is on the high end for a frontline defensive unit at 41. Melee attack is good at 28, and melee defense is high at 37, with 7 points coming from its shield. For damage, it has the regular one-handed spear, which deals 31 base with 6 armor piercing damage and 22 bonus against large. Charge bonus is understandably low at 9, but what is most interesting about this unit is that, like many of Amenmesse melee infantry, the Nubian Spearmen also carries a sling with 10 ammo at 210 range, which will deal 19 base and 2 armor piercing damage. It has a very high accuracy of 14 and a reload speed of 7 seconds. For traits, the Nubian Spearman has Strong Vigor, which will keep its fatigue high and prevent it from losing stats to fatigue loss, as well as Hide in Shrub and Forest. For stances, it has the Spear Wall, which will give it Charge Reflect and additional 25% range block chance. Now, comparing this to units from the relevant native unit roster, we have the best comparison being the Kushite Spearmen from the Nubia and Kush native unit roster. And the difference between these two basically boils down to the fact that the Kushite Spearman is a much better spearman, whereas the Nubian Spearman is also a hybrid slinger. And we can notice this from the stats, as the Kushite Spearman will have a 25-point armor edge and a 20% range block chance edge, and the speed and charge bonus difference here are not going to be super important. And the range part of the stats, which is what separate these two units, is also not that important in my opinion, as this range damage being a sling damage is not that high, with most of it being base. And while it's better than nothing, I think the Spearmen are designed to be your frontline defensive wall, and they don't really need the sling. So aside from having Strong Vigor, which is very useful, I would still heavily favor the Kushite Spearmen over the Nubian Spearmen when playing as Amenmesse. Also in Tier 3, Amenmesse faction has the Nubian Swordsmen, which has similar stats to the Spearman variety. It has slightly less armor at 45 because it's carrying a smaller shield, which only provides 15 points of armor instead of 30. And this means the shield only blocks 25% of the range hits coming from the front instead of the 45%. More shockingly, it has one less melee attack despite using a more offensive weapon, and the melee defense is less by 4 points, which is not surprising as the spear is the more defensive option. The damage profile is slightly better at 32 and 8, but just slightly, and there is no bonus damage against large. Of all its melee stat, only its charge bonus is significantly better when compared to the Spearman variety, as it has 17 versus 9. Lastly, both units will have the same range stats with the sling and the same traits, but the swordsman, instead of having the spear wall, will just have hold, which once again is a huge loss. Overall, the Nubian Swordsman is a weak unit and should not be recruited at all, as the Spearman variety does so much better in every aspect. And when looking at direct comparisons from the native units, we'll find that there are actually 0 Tier 3 swords units in the 3 relevant rosters that we're comparing from. So the best comp we can find here is going to be the Nubian Clubmen from the Nubia and Kush native unit roster, which honestly is just a much better unit across the board. But despite this, I still don't strongly support recruiting the Nubian Clubmen, as I rated them as only situationally good back in the Nubia and Kush native unit guide. This is because, well, they're obviously designed to be an offensive melee infantry with the club weapon. They're simply too balanced in terms of their melee attack and defensive stats, and too slow for effective flanking or chase down of enemy range units. They're just better as a frontal attacker designed to grind away at enemy armor, but as Amenmesse, you want to feature your strong range units, so a more passive front line is needed, and your offensive melee infantry should really focus more on flanking and chase down of enemy range instead of this frontal charge. So to this end, if you're looking for an offensive option in Tier 3, the Libu Warriors from the Western Desert native unit roster is actually a better option for Amenmesse, as you get this powerhouse offensive flanking unit with the best desert combat traits and offensive focused stances such as Advance, not to mention the 39 points of melee attack and high melee damage from their two-handed axe. Now, moving on to Tier 4, or the pinnacle of Amenmesse's melee infantry, we have the Kushite Royal Guard, which is a Kapesh and Shield infantry with your 120 unit count, 19,200 total health, or 160 per unit. It has 90 armor, with 30 coming from shield. Armor quality is good, and the shield will have 45% range block chance. Morale is solid at 60, speed is average at 37, while melee attack and defense are superb, and very balanced at 32 and 33. Kupesh deals 31 base damage and 18 armor piercing, plus 4-point bonus against shield. The charge bonus is okay at 20, slightly low, and they carry 4 javelins, which will have 75 range, deals 14 base and 23 armor piercing damage with a super high accuracy of 15 and a reload speed of 6 seconds. For traits, it will have Hide Forest, Encourage, which will boost morale of nearby allies, but does not stack with the general's Encourage ability. And finally, Flanking Defense Improved, which will reduce your stat loss when being flanked. For stances, it has the basic Give Ground in advance, but also Shield Wall, which will add 25% to their range block chance, but instead of Charge Reflect, it will give Expert Charge Defense, which is basically Charge Negation. The difference here is actually pretty important. Charge Reflect will add the enemy charge bonus to your stats, but does not reduce the enemy charge damage. So your unit will still get badly damaged from enemy charge, but you will return the same damage back, killing the charging enemy faster. For Expert Charge Defense, the enemy charge bonus is instead reduced to 0. You do not get any boost from it, but the enemy loses all their charge bonus damage, which greatly reduces the damage you will take overall. And since for units like Chariots, most of their damage are from the charge bonus, you basically render them useless. So at the end of the day, the Kushite Royal Guard is actually a great defensive frontline unit. As you can see, they don't even have move while shooting. So you can't actually throw those javelins on the charge. You have to kind of set your unit. And they're great at withstanding being charged. They're good at protecting flanked. And if you want to use them offensively, you can let the enemy charge into you and then use stances such as Advance, push deep into the enemy line, and you have the trait of improved flanking defense to help protect you as you push into most of the enemy, which will flank you naturally. And then you can create other opportunities for your other units once you're in that situation. It's a very well-rounded infantry unit in the game. And for direct comparisons with the relevant native unit rosters, the Upper Egyptian Kupesh Warriors come immediately to mind because they use the same weapon, and despite having slightly better stat lines across the board, their smaller unit size of being an elite Upper Egyptian unit, of just having 90 units versus 120 for the Kushite Royal Guards, makes the Upper Egyptian Kupesh Warriors much worse, since you can't really make up for that 33% difference in unit size. Now, another unit worth mentioning here is the Libu Desert Sword, which is a very different unit because it uses a sword which has a weaker damage profile, but they do fight better in the desert and actually have better defensive stats, especially if you add on the bonus they can get from their defense stance, which will give them 7 more points of melee defense. But at the end of the day, all things considered in Tier 4, I still think the Kushite Royal Guard is a more well-rounded unit and the better choice to bring into the late game, as you'll be battling your way out of Egyptian deserts by that time. And if you're not fighting in the desert, the Libu Desert Sword will lose a lot of their advantages from their traits. Now, one last Tier 4 unit worth mentioning is going to be the Upper Egyptian Mace-Axe Warrior, which is a much more offensive-focused melee unit and something that Amenmesse does not possess in his faction unique roster. So definitely consider adding a few of those into your army composition when playing as Amenmesse. Moving on to the range recruitment building and Amenmesse's faction unique range infantry units, we are going to see a building chain that upgrades from Tier 2 to 3 and then gaps up to Tier 5, which is where we will see Amenmesse's best units. And starting in Tier 2, we have the Kushite Archer Militia, which has 90 unit count, 9,900 total health, or 110 per unit. It barely has any armor at 15 points with average quality. Morale is okay at 45. Speed is surprisingly fast at 42. Melee attack and melee defense are nothing to look at 16 and 15. And weapon damage implies they're carrying a sword with 28 base damage and 7 armor piercing. Charge bonus isn't bad at 13, and the range stats are pretty good with above average ammo count of 24, the standard 150 range, 23 and 6 damage split, but accuracy is way above average of 14, while reload time is normal at 6.3 seconds. So the trend here is going to be that Amenmesse's faction unit overall will have better ammo count and accuracy compared to everything else in the game. That's sort of the faction specialty for Amenmesse, and we're going to notice that in all the units as we cover these range units. For traits, it has just hide in shrub and forest. Stance is basic with just hold. It does have an active ability called Blot Out the Sun, which will significantly shorten reload time at the cost of accuracy and stamina. This is a great ability to use, especially considering Amenmesse's range units have much higher base accuracy, which means the penalty from Blot Out the Sun will affect them much less. For comparisons, the Kushite archers immediately come to mind. Now, the only takeaway here you're going to need is that while the Kushite archers are going to be much better armored and have slightly better melee stat, the range stat heavily favors the Kushite archer militia, as all of Amenmesse faction unique unit, as we mentioned before, will have high ammo count and high accuracy, and these are the stats that matters when you're recruiting range units. So the Kushite archer militia is going to be better. Likewise, we can also compare the Kushite Archer Militia to the Libu Hunters, which is also in this tier. It's going to be a better unit in terms of melee stat, but it's going to lose big in terms of ammo and accuracy once again, which makes the Kushite Archer Militia the better option. Even though I would argue that lower tier archers in general should just be avoided, since you don't want them in your mid to late game armies as they lack fire arrows and just does not have high enough stats. And in the early game, it's often better to just go with massing melee infantry, as with the way how skirmish mode works with the AI, if you have a balanced army, they have a balanced army, the battles tend to be more fair. But if they have a balanced army with melee and range and you have just all melee, what often happens is that you just get a free chase down against their range unit if you go all melee, and then you come back and flank and easily win these battles. So I don't really recommend recruiting any of these tier 2 archers. Moving on to tier 3, we have the Nubian Mercenary Bowmen, which is going to be the early Longbowmen unit for Amenmesse with 90 unit count, total health of 10,800 or 120 health per unit. It is also lightly armored at just 15 points with good quality armor. Its morale is decent at 50, speed is good at 42, melee attack is above average at 22, but melee defense on the weaker side is just 14. For melee weapon, the Nubian Mercenary Bowman actually carries an axe that deals 22 base and 22 armor piercing damage with 5-point bonus against shield. This is a very good melee weapon. And the charge bonus is lacking a bit at just 16, given the nature of its melee weapon, but overall for archer unit, it's understandable. Now, range stat is where the Nubian Mercenary Bowmen shine, with 21 ammo and a massive 230 range. For damage, it has 26 base damage and 9 armor piercing. Accuracy is high at 15, and reload time is slow, but standard for longbow at 10.2 seconds. For traits, it has Flaming Shot, and it has the least penalty of all the Flaming Shot, as the longbow only loses 2 points of armor piercing damage and the same 20 range. It has Strong Vigor and Hide in Shrub and Forest. For stances, it has Hold and Fall Back, which is a faster organized retreat at the cost of stamina. For comparison's sake, there is only the Nubian Longbowmen, but it's weaker in every regard except for melee defense, which is not very important for a range unit for the most part, so this one's not even close. Then also in tier 3, Amenmesse has the Nubian Slingers, which is a slightly special unit because it also carries a shield. It has 90 units and the same 10,800 health or 120 health per unit. It has an armor of 25 because you get 15 from its small shield. The armor quality is good, and the small shield will offer the same 25% range block chance. Morale is average of 50, speed is okay at 40, and melee attack and defense just average at 19 and 23. Defense is higher here because the shield is offering 5 points. For melee damage, this unit will use a sword with 32 base damage and 8 armor piercing. The charge bonus is going to be much lower here at 13. For the range stats, we are going to see the standard slinger damage of 23 base and 3 armor piercing, 220 range and a reload time of 5.9 seconds. But once again, ammo is going to be slightly above average at 34, and accuracy is going to be super high again at 15. For traits, it has Strong Vigor and Hide in Shrub and Forest, while for stances, it's just limited to Hold. Overall, this is going to be slightly better than your average slinger, but as all slingers, it's going to be a terrible unit because the damage is just so low with 3 points of armor piercing from your range damage. And we have no comps for this unit, as no other roster has a tier 3 slinger unit. One range unit worth noting here in tier 3 is going to be the Libu Desert Skirmishers, which is an excellent javelin infantry that definitely can be considered by Amenmesse should the army need a few armor-piercing options, as not only does javelins hurt, they also carries an axe as their melee weapon, which offers very high damage, and their melee attack is also very impressive at 31 for a range unit on top of that. Now, Amenmesse does not have a tier 4 range recruitment building, as it will jump directly to tier 5, so there's not going to be any tier 4 units. But from the native unit roster, which does max out at tier 4, there is the renowned Nubian Longbowmen, which can be considered as a top tier range recruit, especially if you want to save gold, as all tier 5 units will have a gold cost and a gold upkeep cost. And since we already highlighted why the renowned Nubian Longbowmen are so great in our Nubian Kush native unit guide, we're going to just skip ahead and move on to tier 5. And starting in tier 5, we are going to have the Kushite Armor Archers. This unit here only has 80 unit, so a small reduction from the standard 90 unit. Its total health will be 11,200 or 140 health per model. It has superb armor of 80, with 15 coming from its small shield, and the armor quality is going to be excellent. The small shield will provide 25% range block chance, which is uncommon once again, as you usually don't see an archer holding a shield. Morale is going to be high at 60, but speed is going to be slow at 37, mainly due to its high armor count. Melee attack is pretty good at 29, but melee defense is actually pretty bad at 24, since you do get 5 points from its shield. For its melee damage, this unit will have 34 base damage and 21 armor piercing damage, and 4 points bonus to shield, which actually implies that this unit is using a tier 5 Kapesh, which is an excellent weapon with great damage here. The charge bonus is going to be lacking at just 18. For its range stat, it's going to have high ammo again at 22, above average range at 200, which is above average since composite bows usually only have 190 range. Its range damage is solid with 32 base and 14 armor piercing, and accuracy is great at 17, while reload speed is standard at 7.2 seconds. For traits, it's going to have Flaming Shot, and we'll see the typical deduction for composite bows, and it also can hide in forests. For stances, it has Hold and Fall Back, but for abilities, it has not only Blot Out the Sun, but also Aim True, which will give up half of their range for a 5-point increase in accuracy. It will also increase reload time by 30%, but it does give it the Sharpshooter trait, which will allow this unit to ignore all range block chance offered by shields entirely. This ability does have some big drawback, but it's particularly good in siege battles where you have time to fire freely into the enemy frontline shielded units near entrances, as the Sharpshooter trait will ignore their shield entirely. Overall, the Kushite Armor Archers are a top-of-the-line archer unit that is well-rounded for range and melee combat. It suffers slightly from its smaller unit size, but that's the price you pay for being an elite unit with any tier 5 range unit that you're going to see here. And we're going to see that play out the same way with our other tier 5 range unit in the Ta-Seti Longbowmen, which will also have 80 unit count, 11,200 health or 140 per unit. The armor will be lower at 45, but it still has the excellent quality rating. Morale and speed will be the same at 60 and 37, while melee attack and defense will be a tad higher at 30 and 26. For melee weapons, this unit is going to be using a top tier spear that will deal 41 base and 14 armor piercing. While the armor piercing damage is going to be lower here, it will have a 36 bonus point against large and 29 charge bonus on top of that. So basically, if a chariot is trying to flank your backlines and you have Ta-Seti Longbowmen, you actually just charge back at them and you will easily kill off the chariots. But ideally, you don't get charged and instead get to use your 20 ammo bow at 240 range, which are both above average, as this is the longest range in the game, and you'll deal 34 base damage and 11 armor piercing damage with 17 accuracy and 9.6 second reload speed, which is once again above average even for a longbow here. The flaming shot penalty for this unit will be a tad higher than the normal longbowman penalty, as you will lose a bit more damage, but still much less compared to other bow types. Aside from the flaming shot, the Ta-Seti Longbowmen will also have strong vigor and hide in forest. For stances, it will have fall back and spear brace, since they are carrying that spear, which will give them even more tools against flanking chariots. And lastly, They also will have the Aim True ability, which will give them more accurate and shield penetrating shots. At the end of the day, you can't go wrong with either the Ta-Seti Longbowmen or the Kushite armored archers, and can even mix them up in any army. For example, have a few Kushite armored archers in the middle of your formation to trade shots with enemy archers, which will take advantage of their shield and high armor value, while the Ta-Seti Longbowmen can cover the rear and side flanks just in case enemy chariots decide to get any ideas. Either way, you can't go wrong with these two units. Now lastly, Amenmesse only has one chariot recruitment building, which is going to be a tier 4 building, and from this building he can recruit 2 chariots. The first is going to be the Kushite Chariot, which is your standard medium chariot with 28 unit count, 14,560 health or 520 health per unit. It has a good quality armor worth 50 points, a morale of 55, speed of 103, which are all very standard. Its melee attack and defensive stat are poor at 21-18, and weapon damage is low at 30 base and 17 armor piercing, but the charge bonus is great at 63. And because of this combination stat, you only want to be in melee combat when you are charging. For its range stat, it will have 60 ammo, which is not that high given that you only have 28 unit. The range is going to be 190, which makes this a composite bow, and the damage match that as well with 28 base and 12 armor piercing. The accuracy is great at 25 and reload speed is decent at 6.4 seconds. There are no special traits here, with only the chariot default fire while moving and mounted sharpshooting for 360-degree shooting. And for stances, you're going to have hold, which is basically useless on a chariot. Then for your other chariot option, you have the Nubian Chariot, which is a light chariot variety. And this is why you will have 36 unit count here. And while this is better for your range damage output, it's not great for melee and maneuverability, as more likely you get stuck on either enemy unit, terrain, or yourself. Its total health will be 14,760, meaning it will only have 410 health per chariot. This is standard. The armor is much lower at 30 of good quality. Morale is still at 55, but speed is up because we have a lighter chariot at 120. And melee attack and defense are still bad at 21-18. Weapon damage is the same with 30 and 17. Charge bonus is going to be weaker, as this is a lighter chariot at just 48, but still decent enough to use as a charging unit, especially running down enemy range. Speaking of range, the range stats on the Nubian Chariot is decent at 60 ammo, 230 range, which makes this a longbowman. The damage is going to have 31 base and 10 armor piercing. Accuracy is going to be equally high at 25, and reload speed is fast for a longbow at 8.0. We're going to have the same traits and stances as the Kushite Chariots and as with most chariots overall. Now, for comparison, there's only one chariot unit in the 3 relevant native unit roster for Amenmesse, and that's going to be your upper Egyptian Chariots, which is also a medium chariot that closely resemble the Kushite Chariot. It has some better melee stats, but worse range stats, so I consider it a draw since you want both aspects in your medium chariot. And honestly, all 3 chariot units are recruitable in small numbers if you want to add a few fast flanking options or harassment options to your armies, even though I would never recruit more than 2 per army. So putting all this together, here is going to be your tier list of units that you should be using in your Amenmesse campaigns. For melee infantry, you start in tier 2 with your Libu Raiders as a cheap but heavy hitting offensive flanking unit. It's viable all the way through the mid game into the late game, but it does require more manual battling as they would not delegate well against more elite units. Moving to tier 3, you have 2 great frontline options in the Kushite Spearmen and the Nubian Spearmen. The Kushite Spearmen are going to be your more traditional defensive frontline unit, while the Nubian Spearmen will add a hybrid range damage with their slings. Offensively, the best unit in this tier is going to be your Libu Warriors, which will play a similar role as the Libu Raiders from the previous tier. You can think of it as a direct upgrade. In tier 4, you have the all-around great Kushite Royal Guard, capable of both defensive and offensive duties, and the Upper Egyptian Mace-Axe Warrior, which is going to be your best offensive glass cannon melee infantry in the game. For range infantry, which is the core strength of Amenmesse's faction, we start in tier 3 with the Nubian Mercenary Bowmen, which is your cheapest longbowman in the game and your best tool at abusing the fire mechanic and their insanely long range. In addition, the Libu Desert Skirmishers are also going to be a great choice in Tier 3 as they excel both in range and melee combat, and most of their damage will be armor piercing, which makes them great against the heavily armored Sea People armies that you'll be dealing with in your mid to late game. In Tier 4, you have the renowned Nubian Longbowmen from the Nubian Kush native unit roster, which is just a slightly upgraded form of the Nubian Mercenary Bowmen, as they do not have the high ammo and accuracy that you will see throughout the faction unique units from Amenmesse. Then finally, for Tier 5, you have both the Kushite Armor Archers and the Ta-Seti Longbowmen, who are both the cream of the crop and useful in their own right, so make sure to get a few of each for every army. Lastly, Amenmesse does not specialize in chariots, so all 3 chariot choices that are available to him play very similarly, and you can consider getting them in small numbers, meaning 1 or 2 for each army, just so that you can abuse the mobility and kiting capabilities of chariots, especially out on an open field. And that is going to do it for our Amenmesse Faction Unique Unit Guide. Hopefully you found all this information helpful, and definitely consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy similar content, or at least hit that like button and leave a comment below to help support the channel. And I'll see you all next time when we move on to cover Tausret's Faction Unique Unit, as that will be the next guide in this series. So until then, bye!